Professor Isidora Stojanovic is from the Institute Jean Nicod. She specializes in philosophy of language, pragmatics, and semantics. And she's going to talk about valence asymmetries in thick terms. Professor, you may start anytime. Thanks.
Okay, thank you so much for inviting me and for the nice introduction. I hope that you can hear me well and see my slides. So I'll be talking about valence asymmetries, mostly in thick moral concepts. It connects with issues about naturalism, about morality especially. So here is the plan for the talk. I will start with what I'm calling the empirical turn in moral philosophy. And by this, I mean the research at the interface between philosophy and psychology, where people are trying to take very seriously folk intuitions, ordinary people's intuitions about moral judgments. And the findings seem to be that moral judgments are perceived as less objective than ordinary natural facts, but more so than taste. And then, so that will occupy me almost for half of the talk, and then I will present some recent evidence, empirical evidence, that seems to show that there is an asymmetry between positive and negative valence, between things that are perceived as good and those that are perceived as bad. And we'll close with something of a puzzle, namely that naturalist approaches to morality shouldn't predict such valence asymmetries. So the empirical turn in moral philosophy, most of you are familiar with the term the linguistic turn, but this is a much more recent trend, I would say. So in metaethics, most philosophers start with the assumption that ordinary people, ordinary speakers, are objectivist or naturalist about morality. And here's two quotes that illustrate this approach very common in metaethics. So for instance, from Stephen Darwall, he says, ethical thought and feeling have objective purport. From the inside, they apparently aspire to truth or correctness, or presuppose that there is something of which they can be true or false. And then Smith writes that ordinary people think that moral questions have correct answers, and that these correct answers are made correct by objective moral facts. That moral facts are wholly determined by circumstances, and that by engaging in moral conversation and argument, we can discover what these objective moral facts determined by these circumstances are. Now, that seems to be an assumption in metaethics, in so to speak, armchair metaethics. But since the beginning of the 21st century, there's been a growing research trying to understand whether this assumption made by philosophers holds. So here are a number of studies. Some of them are very well known, others less so. And what I will do is only pick out one which is illustrative of this approach, not the first one, but the second, from John Darley and from Jeffrey Goodwin from 2008. Called the paper is called The Psychology of Metaethics, Exploring Objectivism from Cognition, because that is the one that really gave an impetus to this empirical research. So what they have done, so this is an experimental approach to morality, and what they've done is to test a number of participants where they presented them with 26 statements that they classified in 4 categories. Ethical statements, such as consciously discriminating against someone on the basis of race is morally wrong. Factual statements, such as frequent aerobic exercising usually helps people to lose weight. Taste statements, Schindler's List, the movie, is a better film than Police Academy. And statements regarding social conventions, such as wearing pajamas and bathrobe to a seminar meeting is wrong behavior, Obviously, that was 2008 during the pandemic. This may have become less of a wrong behavior, but so this is the kind of statements that they presented to their participants, and then they had three-stage task. So first they checked how much the participants agreed with the statement, and they asked them to rate that from 1 to 6. They don't agree at all to agree completely. And then stage 1, they asked them whether they thought it was a true statement, a false statement, or a matter of opinion. And obviously, if they were to decide true or false statements, this would mean that they were objectivist, or thinking that moral facts are made true by objective reality. Whether if they were to say matter of opinion, this would indicate that they were not inclined to objectivism. Then they had the distraction task, and during that the examiner would pick up 5 statements for which the participant at stage 1 said that they agreed to a very high degree, and then they would tell them how a different person completely disagreed with that statement. So then they asked them to choose between the following options. The other person is surely mistaken. It is possible that neither you nor the other person is mistaken, or it could be that you are mistaken and the other person is correct. So again, if the participant says that one of them is surely mistaken, that would suggest that they're objectivist, thinking that there is a correct answer, whereas option 2, that it is possible that neither of them is mistaken, would suggest that there are moral facts about which there is no objective answer. So then they created what they call a scale of objectivism, and I'm showing you right away the results of the study. So what we see, I hope you can see well, is that ethical statements are perceived as significantly less objective than statements about facts, but significantly more objective than statements about social convention, and definitely more so than statements about taste. So this study was discussed a lot because there were various ways of interpreting it, and some people took it to suggest that actually it supports both an objectivist and a naturalist approach to morality, whereas others would emphasize the significant difference between the factual and the ethical. What interests me even more, is that among moral statements themselves, there was a very significant degree of variability. So in this graph, we see various moral statements, and we see that some of them are seen as much more objective. So there's the labels mean the scenarios that Goodwin and Darley had. So, for instance, gunfire was one where it would say something like opening fire on harmless people is wrong. Whereas statements about things such as euthanasia, abortion, stem cell research were perceived as much less objective, namely as things on which one could have a subjective opinion. For instance, whether one should help a person die if they're terminally ill. So this is very interesting, and we'll come back to that when we come to discuss moral asymmetries in valence in moral statements. What I want to do at this stage is also present some experimental work that comes more from linguistic semantics, where questions about various expressions that give rise to so-called faultless disagreement have been discussed a lot since the beginning of the century. So there was an experimental study from Stefan Isolde where what she tried to show is that, again, that there is a variability between the degree to which various statements are perceived as giving rise to what is called faultless disagreement. And then, more relevantly for our purposes, the study that I will briefly present is from Andres Soria Ruiz and Federico Faroldi. It's a paper called Moral Adjectives, Judge Dependency, and Holistic Multidimensionality. What basically what they did is use Salt's paradigm, but they also included moral adjectives. So the paradigm was very simple. The participants would be shown a dialogue between two characters, fictional characters, Mary and John or whatever, and they would be of the form of comparative judgments. For instance, saying something like, chocolate ice cream is tastier than strawberry ice cream. And the other one would say, no, strawberry ice cream is tastier. And so what the participant had to do is give their opinion as to, in that kind of disagreement, one of the disagreeing parties is right and the other wrong, or whether it's more a matter of opinion. So again, so here, before presenting the results, here is the list of adjectives that they tested. The first 5 subclasses were taken from Stephanie's old study. So adjectives like tall and expensive, empty, full, which tend towards the objective side, but also evaluative adjectives such as tasty, ugly, intelligent. So they are not all adjectives of personal taste, but they have this subjective feeling. And then 3 types of what we might, well, especially 2 types of moral adjectives: the thin ones, which are the ones that don't have much descriptive content, namely moral, ethical, and virtuous. And then the thick concepts, which are adjectives which combine a descriptive and evaluative aspect, namely coward, generous, loyal, and honest. So here are the results. It's probably difficult for you to see the exact the words, but basically what I want you to look at is this variability. So we go in the range of adjectives that were all claimed to give rise to faultless disagreement. We see a great variability, and I will focus on 3 subtypes. So this is the graph that you saw just before, but where I am taking out some of the adjectives, because what I'm focusing on are subclasses. So adjectives that you see at the top are tall, full, expensive, empty. So those would be the statements like, this bottle is fuller than that one, or this book is more expensive than that one. They are perceived as having an objective answer. On the bottom, you see adjectives such as ugly and tasty. They are perceived as being very subjective. And then ethical, moral adjectives, again, similarly as with what we've seen before, they are neither perceived as factual, objective, nor as really subjective. They sort of fall in the middle. Okay, so some interim conclusions. What we see from this empirical turn is that it does not fully support objectivism, and to this extent, it speaks against a simplistic version of naturalism about morality. Why does it do so? Because if naturalism about morality, namely the idea that, so I'm speaking about a very simplistic version, the idea that there is really not much of a difference between moral facts and ordinary facts about nature, If this were right, this kind of view would need to give a story to explain why they don't seem at all to be such to us, to ordinary people. Right. Interestingly, however, it's not just that we have a straightforward answer as to whether people are or are not objectivist, because what we see is that folk intuitions about moral statements vary to a large extent, and a series of further studies that I showed you at the beginning. What they did was explore those various factors of variation. So one important factor of variation, and that one was explored by a subsequent study from Goodwin and Darley, is whether there is a perceived consensus on moral issue. And that already explains why very controversial things like euthanasia or abortion are perceived as less objective, because there are ones on which there is no consensus, whether there is a pretty solid consensus that one shouldn't open fire or be racist and so on. There are studies from Sarkisian that really test the context in which the disagreeing parties are disagreeing, and specifically whether they belong to the same culture or to different cultures. There are interesting studies that show that participants' age matters. So young people tend to be less objectivist than old people. But I'll quote here Sarkisian, who says, so he has a very nice survey article where what he points out is that rather than asking something as general as whether people are objectivist or relativist, for example, we might ask, under what conditions do folk show a tendency toward objectivism? Which type of folk show this tendency for which issues? So I'm now moving to yet a more recent set of empirical research, and that gave the title for my talk, namely Valence Asymmetries, asymmetries between the positive and the negative. So I'll try to present briefly four studies that point out such an asymmetry, and I'll point to yet a number of other studies. The one I'm beginning with is, again, from Goodwin and Darley, so that's why it was useful to present their 2008 studies, because so in 2010 they ran a study where what they were looking at is how the degree of consensus affects perception of objectivity. And then in 2012 they wanted to see how moral statements among themselves varied. So it's a paper entitled "Why Are Some Moral Beliefs Perceived to Be More Objective Than Others?" Also, what they've done is correct some methodological potential problems of their previous studies. So in this one, we had similarly, so it was not just outright statements as they did in the first study. That was one of the problems because the statements were given out of context. Here they gave a story, a vignette, it's called a vignette, and then they looked at statements. So this time there were only two factual, two on social conventions, two on personal taste, and then 12 moral statements that were split in 6 negative, 3 positive, and 3 on controversial issues. By negative, I don't mean the syntax that it's a negation of something, but rather that the statement is about a moral act that is wrong or bad, whereas the positive ones are about what is morally correct or a good thing to do. So they would ask the participants to which extent they agreed with the statement. So this was rated on a scale. Then whether they thought there was a correct answer to whether the statement is true. And the difference between the previous study is that this was rated on a scale from 1 to 6, not just a yes, no, but to which extent they thought there was a correct answer, and then to which extent they thought that one of the persons is mistaken as opposed to neither party being mistaken. And then again, they used questions 2 and 3 to create a scale of objectivity. So here are the results. The scale of objectivity they had went from 1 to 6. And so very interestingly, so what we see is that among moral statements, some are perceived as extremely objective. So there was one story about stealing a person's wallet or punching a person in the face. So you see the steal wallet story had a 5.43 rating, whereas what they call the contested value of life issues, namely euthanasia and abortion, are not extremely low, but they are around 3. So neither subjective nor objective, but significantly less objective than some other ones. The most interesting thing for me is that on positive acts, they were perceived as less objective than the negative ones. And so here is a quote. They say that present data shows that the valence of moral beliefs is a robust predictor of their objectivity. Beliefs about the wrongness or badness of negative moral actions, stealing, robbing, cheating, were seen as reliably more objective than beliefs about the rightness or goodness of positive moral actions. Donating money to charity, performing a swim rescue, contributing to environmental causes. And interestingly, so they showed that this didn't vary correlate between how much the participants agreed with these actions. It's not that there was more agreement about the truth of negative actions. It seemed to be really a valence effect. Unfortunately, they didn't really control for valence. So even though they say that valence is a robust predictor, even if it's unlikely, it could turn out to be a coincidence of the stories they've chosen. And some further studies tried to show and control valence in a better way. I'm now moving to a study that has been discussed a lot in philosophy. It's a different kind of valence effect. And this is a paper from Josh Knob from 2003 from Analysis. So what Joshua Knob did is run some experiments where, again, there was a vignette in which he varied 2 conditions. So I'm going to read the scenario. The vice president of a company went to the chairman of the board and said, "We are thinking of starting a new program. It will help us increase profits, but it will also harm the environment." So that was the harm condition, the negative condition. And the other one would say, "But it will also help the environment." The chairman of the board answered, "I don't care at all about harming the environment. I just want to make as much profit as I can. Let's start the new program." They started the new program. Sure enough, the environment was harmed and helped in the health condition. Then they asked participants, how much blame does the chairman deserve in the harm condition, or how much praise does the chairman deserve? That was the health condition. And the second question was whether the chairman harmed or helped the environment intentionally. So whether he did. So the harming of the environment was not the primary action of the chairman. It was a side effect of what the chairman did. And so what they initially wanted to do is to test was what were people's intuitions about the intentionality of side effects. That was the initial aim of the research. But very famously, the research also showed that this varied very robustly with the valence of the actions. In the harm condition, most subject, 82%, said that the agent brought about the side effect intentionally, whereas in the help condition, it was really the reverse. Most subjects, 77, said that they did not bring about the side effect intentionally. So in the harm condition, they would say that the chairman harmed the environment intentionally, but when his action helped the environment, they consider that just to be a side effect, not an intentional action. And when he also compared the several studies, so in general, subjects would say that the agent deserved blame in the harm condition, but they didn't think that they deserved praise in the help condition. So, and they concluded that this correlates with judgments about intentionality. A third study I'm looking at here is from Paul Legret and Florian Cova from 2015. And what they were looking at are judgments about quantifiers, the quantifier many. So here is the kind of story. So they ran a number of studies, and this is just one. This is their study 2, where they would, here on the slide, I'm using a variable, but it would go something like this. A boat sailing on a shallow river with 60 passengers on board hits a sandbank and begins to sink. 30 of the 60 passengers drown and die. 30 are able to reach the shore. And then there was a different condition where it would say 30 of the 60 passengers drown and die. 30 are able to cling to the remains of the boat, and 2 days later are saved by a cargo ship that luckily sees them. So they had various numbers, a small number like 10, 60, and I think it was 200 or so. So then they would say, they would ask 2 questions, and they varied the order of the questions. Would you say that many passengers died? So it's a negatively valenced predicate. Or would you say that many passengers survived? And so they tested that with various predicates. Die and survive are very strongly valenced. There were others which are like succeed and fail. That also fail is negative, succeed is positive, and so on. So here on the die survive, what we see is that when it's a negative one, the judgments about how many died are much higher. So they tend to, like, everyone thinks that 50 out of 100 is many when people are dying, whereas when it's about surviving, the numbers are much smaller. Still, there are more than half of the participants think that when 50 passengers survive out of 100, it is many, but significantly less so than when they are dying. So here is a quote that sums up this kind of conclusions. Subjects lowered the standard relevant to ascribe many for more negatively valued predicate. Judgments involving many are sensitive to moral considerations in a broad sense, namely to expectations involving a representation of the desirability as opposed to mere probability of the outcome. I'm now moving to some of our recent work. It's work I've done with my colleagues Bianca Cepolaro and Filippo Domaneschi. We already had a number of studies that were published in 2021, that is last year. Actually, they were published online 2 years ago in Synthese, in a paper called When Is It Okay to Call Someone a Jerk? An Experimental Study of Expressives. And so we've done some sequels to those studies where what we were looking at is whether the content carried by expressive pejoratives such as jerk are perceived as being subjective or agent-oriented, namely as simply expressing that the speaker's attitude, negative attitude about the person they're calling a jerk, or rather whether they're objective or what we call target-oriented, namely that saying that someone is a jerk means that this person really deserves it and has done something bad. This is important in the context of linguistic theories of expressives, because the mainstream view on expressives treats them as simply expressing one's subjective attitude. So the mainstream view is that if you're using a pejorative, what you're simply conveying is that you don't like this person, rather than something evaluative about the person themselves. And we used control items, which were non-expressive evaluatives that had this moral feeling, positive ones such as nice, generous, and so on, and negative ones such as unbearable and dishonest. So the task would go something like this. There is first a scenario. Sarah, Luca, and Chiara at the bar with friends. Marco is drinking coffee at another table. So introducing a context. And then at the second stage, which is still a description of the context, we varied different conditions. One would be that the agent-oriented one, the subjective one, Luca dislikes Marco. The target-oriented one, Marco is a fake and dishonest. And a neutral one, where there was just no further specification. And then the target sentence with the pejorative was Marco is a jerk. With the positive one, Marco is nice or Marco is adorable. And with the negative one, something like Marco is dishonest, Marco is unbearable, and so on. And so what we have seen first with pejoratives, and this was the focus of the study, was that they are much more acceptable in a context in which it is common ground that the person is objectively bad, or has done something bad, has done something to deserve to be called a jerk, rather than a context in which it is simply the speaker who holds them in low opinion. And they're both more acceptable than in a context in which there is just no information about the target, and that replicates some of the results from our first study. But interestingly, and that's something that we didn't expect, we've also seen a strong valence asymmetry. So in the neutral condition, that's where we tested controllers, positive and negative evaluatives. And what we see is that positive evaluatives are much more acceptable than the negative ones, and these in turn then pejoratives. And then we also had a second task in which we asked participants to select a suitable paraphrase for a sentence such as Marco is a jerk, Marco is nice, Marco is unbearable. And very interestingly, when people are selecting paraphrases, so I'm not sure how well you can see that, but basically for positive fillers, for positive words like nice and honest and generous, people would select a paraphrase of the sort, the speaker has a good opinion of the target, rather than the target is good. Whereas for negative fillers, it was the other pattern. So participants would say, Marco is unbearable means that he has done something bad, rather than that the speaker holds them in low opinion. So this was something we didn't expect, and it suggests a valence asymmetry. And here are a number of yet further studies showing valence asymmetries of all types of sorts. So it's a bit like once you've seen a couple, all of a sudden you start seeing valence asymmetries all around. So these are some studies that I'd be happy to comment when if you have interest in the Q&A. But basically what's interesting is that There is evidence from psychology, from experimental philosophy. So, for instance, Zaku and Dinges, they showed the valence asymmetry on retraction about statements of personal taste. Pascal Willemsen and Kevin Reuter, in a recent paper in Thought, they show the valence asymmetry when it comes to canceling the evaluative implications of using a thick term. And then there are several studies from linguistics, from semantics, that show also that we derive different implicatures depending on whether the statement has negative valence or positive valence. So I only have about 4 minutes, and what I would like to do is go back to the topic of the conference, namely what do these studies about valence asymmetry tell us about naturalism. It does seem that valence asymmetries speak against at least a naive version of moral naturalism, about morality. So in the talk, I haven't really made much of a distinction between objectivism and naturalism about morality. I've sort of grouped them as the same kind of approach. But basically, if moral properties such as generous and selfish, honest and dishonest, are treated on a par with natural properties, like being made of wood, having a mass number 12, and so on, then it is unclear why moral properties should even split between positively and negatively valence properties. So it's unclear. One would expect that even if we have this kind of difference, there wouldn't be such a big difference between the two. There would just be two types of natural properties, but wouldn't generate so much of an asymmetry. So this is not really a straightforward argument against naturalistic approaches. It really is a challenge. The challenge is then to see what explains. Well, first of all, it's a double challenge for naturalism and for everyone. One question is whether all these asymmetries that are kind of coming from different domains really are instances of a single phenomenon, and whether there is one unified explanation as to why we get these differences. And at any rate, what that explanation was, and if there are several explanations. So the challenge becomes to look for these explanations. So of course, a naturalist who claims that moral facts are just like natural fact would probably try to look at sort of a psychological explanation. But really, the intriguing question is why natural properties of different sort would elicit such radically different psychological responses. And I am closing with this. So even though in the abstract I said I would sketch some possible solutions on the behalf of naturalism, I want to leave you with a puzzle instead of a conclusion. The semi-conclusion is that this recent empirical turn in moral philosophy shows that moral judgments are sensitive to all sorts of parameters. It's not just that they show that people are objectivists or not, but that there is a lot of variation, and valence, positive or negative, seems to be one such crucial but understudied parameter. So understanding the nature of valence and how it impacts cognition and language and our judgments about morality suggests really a new research agenda for philosophy and for interdisciplinary research. So thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you for your fascinating talk. We have, I guess, something like 15 minutes for